All right, I'm back, and we're going to talk about language in this segment. So let's get started. Now, I mentioned before, I'm a cognitive psychologist, so clearly, my memory chapter was my favorite. This chapter is my second favorite, and within this chapter, the language section, I'm really passionate about. In grad school, I studied language and bilingualism, and I really enjoy it. So I'm sorry if I belabor some linguistic principles too much and you find it boring, but bear with me. I think it's fascinating. So how is our language structured? How is any language structured? What makes the difference between a natural language that evolved with humans versus an artificial language that has been created on purpose? Language structure. Well, phonemes are the speech sounds that are available to compose, be put together to make the language. Humans can make about 125 different phonemes, different sounds. Some of these sounds we use as part of our language. In American English, we use about 65 of those phonemes as part of our language, and then another 20 or 25 as sound effects or reactions or different sounds that don't really necessarily contribute to our language. They to the actual language. They contribute to like context. So in English, we don't trill our R's for anything, but for some people, at least in American English, we don't trill our R's. But some people have maintained that skill and they use it to make, for example, the sound of a purring kitten or motorboat, right, or something like that. So trilling your tongue might be used for some different purpose than actual speech sound. So we preserve about altogether between actual language and then other sound effects and reaction sounds. We preserve about 85 of the 125 possible phonemes in American English. The other sounds we can't make and we actually can't hear. If we've been American English speakers our whole lives, we literally can't hear the other speech sounds, which is kind of interesting. We'll talk about that more in a second. She's amazing. She goes through 21 different accents, like one after the next, and does such a good job. And actually, she's an actress, but she also coaches people in dialects so that they can act using dialects. And so this video is really fun to watch as she goes through the different phonemes that make up accents. And that's something that's really important for us to all realize is that while I'm saying American English, there's no such thing as a single American English accent, right? There's all sorts of regional accents and things. So when I say on average we have about 85 speech sounds that we can hear and produce for one reason or another, that can vary by region. So I was raised in Southern California, and I think that might have helped me to still be able to trill my R's because the people around me spoke Spanish. I heard it all the time. Ultimately took Spanish and studied it, and actually studied bilingualism using Spanish-speaking participants. But being exposed to the speech sounds from the time that you're really young helps to preserve your ability to perceive them and then later be able to produce them with less of an accent. Anyway, so everybody has accents, in other words. I always think that I don't have one because I feel like I just have sort of a generic West Coast accent, but apparently I have an accent. I kind of pick up with the speech style of whoever I live around too. Morphemes are the meaning units that make up the language. So if you look at these words, you'll notice they both have E-M-E-S at the end. E-M-E is a morpheme that means unit. And then S means pluralize it. That's a morpheme that refers to pluralizing the entire word. The phone part means sound, right? That's what that meaning unit means. Morph means body. That's what that meaning unit means, right? So you put things together, you put these morphemes together and make words. So now it's really important to distinguish between a morpheme and a syllable, right? A lot of times people think that you you learned how to break words down into syllables, and they think, oh, well, that's a morpheme. No, a morpheme is the meaning unit. So sometimes a morpheme will span a syllable, right? It'll take 2 syllables or more to make up one morpheme. Sometimes it's a single letter, like the S, to make a plural. So morphemes are those meaning units that make up the different words. And then grammar is the system of rules that allows us to produce language in a coherent way so other speakers can understand us. Semantics is the whole study of how we understand each other, how we can convey the thoughts that are in our head to the person who's trying to either hear us or read what we're saying. And syntax refers to the rules that govern how we structure our sentences, how we conjugate our verbs, things like that. If you are a native speaker of a language, a lot of times you are completely unaware of all these syntactical rules that are governing your speech. Usually it's when you're learning your second language and you start learning all these rules and you think, why does this language have so many rules? And you find out, wait, they all have rules. It's just one of them I learned when I was so little, and it just happened sort of naturally. And here I'm actually memorizing a bunch of rules so I can impose them on my sentences and on my conjugations and things. I remember when I took Spanish, I was 14, and I said to my teacher, why do they have these conjugation rules in Spanish instead of like English where you just have different words for everything? And she's like, we don't have different words for everything. We're conjugating on the fly also. I was like blown away. I'm like, what? No, we're not. Yeah, we are. Every language you conjugate. And really the way that languages are clustered together, you've heard of things like Romance languages or Asiatic languages or Germanic languages. The way that they're clumped together is based on their syntactical rules. A lot of times it seems like they're being clustered together because they share cognates, words that kind of sound alike. But it's more important that they share grammar rules. So, how they take a verb and, make it present tense or past tense or something like that is part of that syntactical rule. How you decide to order words within a sentence. Like in English, if I wanted to tell you that I live in a yellow house, the yellow, the adjective comes before the house, the noun, right? So in English, it goes adjective, noun. In Spanish, that's inverted. So if I wanted to tell you what color house I live in, I would say I live in a house yellow. So different languages have different rules about word order, conjugation, things like that. And that's one of the things that makes natural languages different from artificial languages. Like in ASL or any of the sign languages around the world, there really isn't a specific grammar like there is in natural languages where you have to attach something to the end of a word or something like that. I know that they make combination signs to mean something like, for brother, you say boy, same, and context allows you to figure out. And that's what semantics is all about, context, figuring out what the person's trying to say from what else they've been saying. So there are certain aspects about ASL that's similar, but one thing that's really different is that a lot of ASL signs look like what they are. So, for example, baby looks like a person holding a baby, right? That's very rare in a natural language. There's not an association between the actual word and then what it's describing. Now, there are some kinds of words where they sound like what they're describing, like clip, clop, describing how a horse's hoof sounds. And that's unique, not very common, and a lot of times those are words that were made up to sound like the sound. I'm talking about like nouns. If I wanted to say that a microorganism was something really small and I was making a word for it, maybe I'd come up with a small word for it rather than microorganism, right? There's no association necessarily between the name of a noun and then any characteristic that it has, whereas in an artificial language that was created on purpose, a lot of times they'll take advantage of, like the sign for dog, you can either do, or you can do tap your thigh and snap like you're calling a dog. They made signs that are logical and make sense. Natural languages aren't really like that. They have what we call arbitrariness. So some differences between the grammar of natural languages versus artificial languages. Now, how do we acquire language? Now, these stages were originally designed to describe acquiring your first language, when you're a baby. Any of you who learned a second language when you were older, you might recognize that you kind of went through some of these stages too in that second language. From birth to 4 months, the noises that babies make that are not cries, we call cooing. So it doesn't have to sound like coo, coo, coo to be called cooing. It's any noise that is not crying. So babies make all sorts of little pleasure sounds or interest sounds, or any kind of noise that's not a cry, we would call a coo. And 0 to 4 months, they tend to be in that cooing stage. At about 4 months, we start to look for babies to make babbling sounds. Babbling sounds are usually consonant vowel alterations, ma, 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 da, 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 da. And babies, regardless of what language they're being exposed to in their household, they babble phonemes from all languages. A lot of times the parents can't hear some of the phonemes that their baby's making. They hear that a sound's coming out, but they don't hear it as the phoneme that the baby's making because it's not part of their language, and they really don't hear those sounds anymore. So if you had, for example, a baby who is in an American household and is babbling, they might be going ha, ha, ha with their throat, and their parents don't really hear it as a speech sound or a babbling sound. They don't really recognize it as that. They think maybe their baby's like clearing their throat or something like that. But it's evidence that babies all around the world are going through all the same experiences with their vocal tract as they're on the road to acquiring a language. Another way that we know that babies speak, all the same language during the babbling phase is that if you take a baby from any part of the world and record the noises that they're making during this early babbling stage, and then play that recording for an adult who speaks any language, they will pick out phonemes from their language. They'll hear the baby making sounds that they know how to make. And so that's evidence that the babies are making lots of sounds. The adults aren't necessarily hearing all of them as sounds that they can replicate. By about 10 months of age, babies start homing in on the speech sounds that they're being exposed to. And so now if we did that same exact test at the end of 10 months, people from different parts of the world would notice that babies are making speech sounds that are similar to theirs if the baby has been exposed to language that's similar to theirs, and they would not be hearing speech sounds from their own language if the baby is from a different language. And usually, pretty different, like English versus Chinese or something like that, or English versus Douay. Oh, I'm sorry, I have a horrible accent in Douay. I can't get that click fast enough. I've read an article that said that the languages that include as a speech sound tend to have a shallower palate than, which is the roof of your mouth, than people whose languages don't have that. That maybe that phoneme was preserved in those areas where people could make that phoneme, right? And that it dropped out of the language in places where they couldn't make that sound. I can make it if I have enough time. Okay, I made it, but I cannot do it in the middle of a word. Apparently it gets stuck. I can't do it. So we start to see that babies are clearly internalizing the language that they're being exposed to and focusing in on the babbles that one day will provide the phonemes for the language that they're going to speak. So here's an experiment that they did where they had Hindi-speaking adults. Hindi has two different kinds of T's. I was taught by a Hindi-speaking person to try and pretend like I could make the two T's. So I'm going to follow very carefully the instructions I was given for tongue position and see if I can make the two different T sounds. So there is T and there is T, 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 T. 100% of Hindi adults can tell the difference between those two sounds when done correctly by a Hindi-speaking person. Then they tested babies. 6 to 8 month olds, 8 to 10 month olds, and 10 to 12 month olds. Okay, now this is when all of the stuff I've been talking to you about since the beginning of this quarter start to come together. So remember, babies can't tell us what they know or recognize. We have to figure out a way to determine whether they're recognizing something or not. So first thing they did was teach babies that when the sound changes in their headphones, that's a cue that these really entertaining toys are going to come on to the baby's right. So if you hear the sound change, turn your head, because there's going to be something really interesting to look at in a second. And so the sound change occurs first. Ooh, neutral stimulus that has become a conditioned stimulus. The sound changes, and then if you turn your head, you're going to see the thing that you want to see, which is these entertaining toys. So sound changes first, toys come on later, like a 1 second delay. So the sound change that they were exposing these babies to was Hindi T's. So they'd hear T, 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 T. And when it changed, they're supposed to turn their head if they can hear the difference and then get to see those toys. And then that's when that operant conditioning part comes in, where they're getting rewarded for correct head turning, right? Like if I hear the sound change and I turn my head, oh, I get to see the toys come on. Okay, so that's the setup. 6 to 8 month olds were almost as good as Hindi-speaking adults at recognizing that the T sound changed and turning their head in anticipation of the toy. By 8 to 10 month olds, we're down to less than 60% of the babies correctly turning their heads when the sound changed. And by 8 to 12 months, only about 10% of the babies were turning their heads in anticipation of the toys. And then we have the English-speaking adults that have not been exposed to a Hindi T. We're at like 0 are turning their heads. They cannot discriminate that Hindi T. They sound the same to them. So we're seeing across the first year of life, babies homing in on the speech sounds that they're being exposed to. So they're getting ready to speak the language that they have been exposed to in their household. There's actually a nice video where they show a version of this test that I just described. It's called Infant Speech Discrimination. It's a nice old, I think it's from the Mind series that was produced in the late 80s on PBS, and it's a really good example of how this is conducted. All right, so by about 12 months old, babies are starting to speak one word in isolation. We call this the one-word stage creatively. And so they say one word, cookie, but they have more meaning than just one word. And they may not say cookie. They might say something kind of more jargony, like they might say something like cookah or something that is their close approximation of what they want. By 18 to 24 months old, babies will start to put words together. We call this the two-word stage. They used to call it telegraphic speech because apparently in the olden days, if you wanted to send a telegram, it cost by the letter. And so you'd try and keep your messages as short as you could. So they called it telegraphic speech. Some developmental psychologists are saying we should call it text speech, because if you've ever tried to text while walking or driving, you're like, coming soon, on my way, on way. Something like that, right? There's two words that conveys a lot of meaning, right? The thing that's important, I thought I had a little bracket here, sorry. The thing that's important to know about the one and two word stages is that babies don't say words in isolation. They combine the words with context. So let's say I'm a one-word stage baby and I want a cookie. So I know mom just baked cookies, they're on the counter. And I'm standing on the ground, you know, being my little 24-inch high person that I am, and I'm pointing at the counter, I'm going, cook, and I'm doing an open, closed hand and a pointing at the cookie. Point at the cookie, open, closed hand, cook, and I say it in a demanding voice, cook. That's a lot of meaning that's actually being conveyed, right? I've got a demanding tone. We're in a room that has cookies that you just cooked. I'm pointing where they are, and I'm saying something that sounds sort of like cookie. Most of the time, parents can figure out what their baby means by these signs. by these one words plus gesture, intonation, and context. Now put two words together plus intonation, gesture, and context, and you actually have a lot of meaning that's being conveyed. My grandbaby is using baby signs. My son studied ASL when he was in college, and so he's been almost exclusively talking to her in ASL since she was born. And then my daughter deliberately used things like milk for nursing. She used food. Now she's trying to teach her water, this is a baby sign. The real sign is this. The baby signs, a lot of times you modify them, so it's something I can do. She knows more. She was just doing another one the other day. I forgot what it was now. Oh, they're trying to, this is the sign that, at least in baby sign, that they use for pain. And so she's trying to get the baby to be able to convey if she's in pain. And even better, like if it's her mouth or it's her knee or something like that. We were all really super excited the other day because the baby, who's 17 months old, did a telegraphic speech phrase using sign, and she can speak too, obviously. She says, she calls my husband Papa, and then I get a sign, like, this is Grandma, and so I try and get her to call me Grandma, and she just goes like this is Grandma. So I'm Grandma, he's Papa. She says Mama and Dada. She calls the dog Do. So she has spoken words too, but she has reached the milestone of telegraphic speech and sign first. So she said more food, right? Like she put together the two signs, and that's really common. If you have a baby who knows both some signs and some words, first off, you get a baby who doesn't cry as much because they can convey their meaning more readily. And then second off, you have babies who can actually advance more quickly through stages because they have like two ways of communicating. Most of us don't know ASL in our family. My son's the only one who's actually fluent, but we all know the basic signs, and we are all like if we don't know something, we ask Uncle to translate for us, or we Google it on YouTube, so we can give her some signs so she can start communicating and not being frustrated. It's not slowing down her language acquisition; it seems to be speeding it up. So it's a really good idea. And I just saw somebody on TV talking about how her 24-month-old baby was crying and things and wanting, having like flipping out when he wanted things and he couldn't convey what he wanted. And I was thinking, teach him some signs. And if you do it from the time they're really little and you go, do you want some milk? And you just do it at the same time. Do you want some food? At the same time that you're saying words, they get both of them, and they can do the hand motions before they can do the speech. And so it makes a lot of sense to teach it to them while they're little. By about 24 months, babies just sort of start using full sentences. There's no such thing as a 3-word stage or a 4-word stage. They go to full sentences. They may not always perfectly use full sentences. They might have some full sentences and some telegraphic speech still. But once they get to about 24 months, they start taking off. Now, these are rough estimates of when people are going to develop. Like I said, this person who was talking about her 24-month-old, that baby was still within the normal range of speech usage. There's a lot of variation in when children reach these milestones, but this is typically the order that they reach them. You might have had experiences when you were learning your second language, if you did, of feeling like you were in the 1-word stage or feeling like you were in the 2-word stage as you were going through acquisition. I think I sometimes even am in the babbling stage still with Spanish, where I'm like, ba, ba, I can't think of the word I want, but don't start talking. I'm thinking of something, ba, ba, thinking. So even with a second language, we might kind of go through some of these same errors and milestones again. There are a couple of theories on how we acquire language, especially our first language when we're babies. Skinner, remember, he's the operant conditioning guy. He, as usual, thought language is just a behavior, and so behaviors come from reinforcement. Like you repeat the behaviors that get reinforced, and you eliminate the behaviors that get punished. And so he said our parents reward and punish us. I mean, imagine when my granddaughter we all went, oh, she said more food. She put two together. She wants more food, right? She conveyed her message, we all reacted not only like directly, yay, good baby, but also she got more food. So we reward, parents, grandparents, peers, teachers, people react to our language positively or negatively, right? They give us what we want, deny us what we want, those kinds of things, and we learn what words, what language works for us. He says that the reason why we acquire language is because it gets us what we want more. The problem with Skinner's model is he has a lot of difficulty explaining mistakes that we see across all languages. And I actually experienced making these same mistakes when I acquired my second language. So I think it's, probably part of language acquisition. I thought I was going to go through the errors next. Don't know my own slides. So some things that children do all around the world, I'll use English examples. But if you speak another language, you can probably think of your own examples that are very similar to this. In English, for example, if you want to say something happened in the past tense, you add ed to it, usually. But not always. There are some exceptions to that rule, like go. The verb go, you don't put an ed on the end of it. But you've heard children say goed or wented, right? They mistakenly put an ed on the end of this irregular verb, go. You either get goed or wented. Usually, if you want to say that something's plural, you put an S on the end of it, but not always. Like sheep is the word, whether it's a singular animal or a herd, right? But you've heard children say things like sheepses or my feet, right? Like feet is already plural, but they know I'm supposed to put an S on the end of it, and so they'll say my feet, things like that. And then superlatives are a really common source of error for children. The rule, if you want to make something a superlative, is you add an est to it. So it's like fastest. Now it's a superlative, right? So you'll hear children doing that to irregular superlatives. So you'll hear them say mostest or bestest. So those are really common errors. Virtually every child in English goes through a phase where they do some or all of those errors, and then they kind of grow out of it. And Skinner really couldn't explain what starts it and what ends it. He said things like, well, they must have been rewarded for these incorrect forms. But he didn't explain how they got generated in the first place. Like, why would a child ever say goed? Their parents don't say goed. Anybody who's older doesn't say goed. So what made them ever say it in the first place? And Skinner couldn't explain that. Now, I will buy his idea that we kind of reinforce sometimes when kids use incorrect forms because it's kind of cute. When my son was little, he called chocolate collocolate. I still call it collocolate half the time because I think it's cute. It's hilarious. I mean, it's already, like he made the word way worse than it already is, collocolate, right? He's like the only one in the family who refuses to ever call chocolate collocolate because, it's embarrassing. He's the one who made it up. But I thought it was adorable. Totally rewarded him for it. Actually, I think we punished him out of it, frankly, because he stopped saying it way before any of us did it. But so I buy it that, yeah, there are some things that families, we laugh and we think it's funny, and then the kid goes, oh, that can make parents laugh or something. I buy that. But how did they ever generate it in the first place? Well, Chomsky has an explanation. He argued that we're born with a universal grammar capability. We actually have a language acquisition device in our brains. He's probably right. There are areas of our brain that are devoted to language processing, and so he's probably at least partly right with this, language acquisition device. The thing that he's most right about is that that once children get to about 1,000 words of vocabulary, they start to make these errors. I remember my own daughter, when she was 2, she correctly would say fell. And then by the time she was 3, she was saying falded. How do you go from knowing fell when you were 2 to saying falded when you're 3? Chomsky would say her vocabulary got so big that she had to stop using just memorized versions of every conjugation of the word and start applying the rules on the fly. And that's when you start to see errors. So he thought that we have genes that design our brain, so that we have certain areas that are devoted to language processing. Clearly, the environment is important in language acquisition, according to Chomsky. I mean, obviously, you need to talk to and around and, for sometimes your child. All of these things come together to actually lead to children mastering the language. Where's my little examples? So, Chomsky says that when a child like my daughter gets to a language, a vocabulary of at least 1,000 words, we're going to actually start taking what had been a series of individual memories of individual words, and we're going to start centralizing them into our frontal lobe so that Broca's area can impose grammar, that is, the rules of the language. And so it's going to take a while for children to go from saying things like feet or goad. It's going to take experience with the language for them to recognize, okay, you can't just on the fly apply the standard rule to certain words. Certain words you're going to have to memorize. Other words you can apply on the fly. The rules apply most of the time. And so the fact that they make errors illustrates that they're using the rules. And one of the things that Chomsky did that was super clever was he designed a study where he taught 3- and 4-year-olds brand new words that they could never have heard of before. For example, he had a doll, and he said, this is a wug. Okay, that's a word that he made up. There's no such thing as a wug. So he says, this doll is called a wug. Now I have two. This is a wug, and this is a wug. What do I have? And the child on the fly says, 2 wugs. Puts an S on the end of it. That shows that they know if you want to pluralize a word, you put an S on the end of it, right? He made up verbs. He had a little toy where it would pull the little toy across the table, and he called it pelling. He said, this is how you pell. And he showed the child how to do it, let the child pell the toy, and then he'd say, what did you just do? And then the child would say, I pelled it, right? Threw an ED on the end of it. So when you take brand new words and teach them to the child right there, the brand new word, and watch them apply the rules, you know that that's how they're actually processing language. So there's a lot of evidence that Chomsky was correct, that we have specialized areas in our brain on the left hemisphere that are designed to process language, and that children, once they get to a certain level of vocabulary, will apply rules on the fly. And we can see it through the mistakes that they make, and we can see it through how they can process brand new words that they've never experienced before. Okay, now what about, animals. Animals can communicate with each other, but not in the way that we can. One of the things that makes human language really special is that we can talk about things that aren't currently here, right? We can talk about, remember when we went and did that thing and it was so fun and you were there and we did all these, we can talk about things that happened in the past. We can talk about things that are going to happen in the future, or that we hope for, or that we are fantasizing about, or, right, we can talk about things that are not here and now. Animals can't really do that. That's one big difference between humans and animals. Animals can communicate with each other about things like food sources, a threat, things like that. They can convey through pheromones, they can convey through body language, they can convey through calls, but they can't talk about, remember last week when we were here, I'm hearing that same noise. They can't talk about stuff like that, which makes human language significantly different from animal language. But what I wanted to talk about is our attempts to teach animals human languages and how that has given us some insight into what animals know and what animals understand. Chomsky actually gave us some really interesting insight into critical periods for language acquisition. Chomsky's mom, Muliki, was the original subject for this language acquisition study. And what you see is Chomsky sitting on a panel of lexicograms. These are just made up symbols, and each symbol represents either a noun or a verb. So there's a symbol there for orange, if he wants an orange. Or there's a symbol for outside, things like that. So that he can pick lexicograms to convey what he is thinking or wanting. He's also really, really good at spoken language. So when a person speaks to him, we call it receptive. He receives the language and he can understand what he's being told to do, and he can do a bunch of behaviors in a row. I mean, his acquisition of language has given us a lot of insight into what bonobo monkeys or bonobo chimpanzees can do. But this critical period thing. So Maliki already had Kanzi when they started the research on her, trying to teach her a language, these same lexicograms. So by definition, she was an adult. She already had a baby. So they tried through, positive reinforcement and associationism to try and teach her the meanings of these different symbols. She got to the level where she had maybe 100 symbols that she could use. That's pretty good. That's pretty good memory. Meanwhile, here's her little baby, just clinging to her during the workday, right? And he's picking it up sort of more like how a human infant would pick it up. And Kanzi has thousands of lexicograms that he can use. And he's also, like I said, got really good receptive verbal language where, humans can talk to him and he can understand. So that experience where Maliki didn't learn very much at all and Kanzi learned really readily shows us that there's a critical period for language in animals too, that, we can't wait until they're a full adult and try and teach them a language. That's just not going to work very well. So that's really interesting findings from that. Alex, the African gray parrot, unfortunately, he died a few years ago, and they had spent, years and years and years trying to train him to use words to describe what he was experiencing. And so they had taught him things like, all the colors, like that the word matter will refer to what something's made up of. So like in this picture, you see that the human is holding one metal key and one plastic key. And so if the human asked Alex what's different, he would say matter when he meant to say that they're made out of different material. If he wanted to, he could say color, right? One of the things that differs in those two keys is color. He might say size. So they had taught him concepts, right? Size, color, shape, matter. So that when they asked him complex questions, he could show his understanding by using these conceptual categories in language. He knew a lot of things. Not to mention, he's a parrot, so he could actually utter phrases, and he would say the cutest things, like when the humans were going home for the day, he'd be like, be a good boy, because apparently they'd always say that to him when they'd leave him, and so he'd say, be a good boy, I'm gonna miss you, stuff like that. He said the sweetest things. Such a cute little parrot. But what was most amazing about the research with him was that he revealed that birds understand category membership, concepts, and things like that. Porpoises have been really interesting as they've been able to use our languages to convey what they know. I think the theme on this whole screen is that animals know stuff. We have to figure out a way for them to communicate it to us in a way that we understand. So with porpoises, obviously they can't speak, they can't, use gestures or anything, but they've got great receptive language. So you can give them a series of instructions and they'll swim through the pool doing the things that you told them to do in the order. You can ask them yes/no questions and they can swim to the yes or the no button to get their response. There are a lot of really interesting things that we now know about how they think based on their ability to answer our questions. And to follow our instructions. So porpoises have given us a lot of insight into, creatures who don't have the kind of vocal structure that would allow them to speak, or hands that would allow them to use ASL or something like that. They can still convey their state of mind using language. So I mentioned gestures. Here we have chimpanzees. This is a picture, obviously, but out in the wild, chimpanzees use gestures like pointing, holding up their hand, and that universal primate message of hold still, right? We've observed through Jane Goodall and other observers that chimpanzees can communicate with gestures all the time. So that's an important thing to know, that they communicate to each other like that. And chimpanzees that have been taught ASL in captivity here in the U.S., they will teach their babies ASL. So like they see the value of it, and it'll transmit through the generations. So chimpanzees can absolutely communicate through gestures. Now, us primates, we tend to use a lot of gestures too, and so people thought that gestures were being used by humans primarily as a way of enhancing the listener's understanding. But if we look at this nice antiquated picture where he's talking on an old-time phone, he's making gestures, and that person on the phone can't see his gestures. He cannot be making these gestures for the listener. So what is the point of the gesture that the speaker makes? Well, I'm actually, one of the reasons why I rarely put my hands up during these lectures is because, for one thing, I think it's probably a little bit distracting, but for another thing, I'm actually locking my hands together, so I'll speak more slowly. I speak way too fast all the time, and so by holding my hands still, I'm benefiting from something that researchers have discovered, which is that when speakers use their hands, it helps them to more fluently come up with the words that they want to say next. And they can be stupid gestures, like you could be just doing this, and it helps you to think of the words. Or you could be going like this, or you could make weird you've seen speakers do all sorts of weird gestures that have nothing to do with the words that they're generating, but it makes it more fluent. I sometimes stumble and am halting because I'm holding my hand still. And it's especially likely that I'll speak haltingly when I'm hearing noises that hopefully you can't hear because of my awesome Trex AutoShocks headphones. I also have this awesome microphone. I should work for the company. I'm always trying to sell them to my students. But so if I can hear things and then my hands are trapped, I start stumbling sometimes because it's distracting to me. But so gestures on the speaker's part are usually for the speaker's benefit, and it's to aid them in picking their next word, conjugating it, and delivering it smoothly. If you think about it, think about how smoothly you usually can talk, that the word just comes to you. It's amazing how you can just generate one word after the next, and you flawlessly conjugate. Every once in a while, you get a Freudian slip where you say the wrong thing, or a spoonerism where you invert the first letters of words so that, I'm trying to think of a good example of a spoonerism. I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy is not technically a spoonerism. It's more of a joke. But that kind of inverting of things. Oh, I was just reading somebody's little holiday prep list, and she said, first you open a bottle of wine, and then by the end it was saying, and open another bottle of wine. That's a spoonerism where you're switching the letters. We don't do them that often. We tend to do them when we're tired or we're distracted or something like that, and it's amazing that we can so easily generate words that make sense to us and to the listener. Gestures help us to do that as speaker. I have one last thing I wanted to say about animal language, which is the issue of when we teach an animal a language, are they actually conveying the meaning that we're getting? Here we have a chimpanzee that knows ASL, and this is the gesture that the chimpanzee makes when it sees the doll. So the trainers say that the chimpanzee made the gesture baby. Did the chimpanzee make the gesture baby? Not exactly. I showed this to my son. I'm like, what would you infer? And he's like, I don't know. That could be a lot of things. It could be love. It could be baby. It could be cold. This could be just a regular gesture. It's not an ASL sign. Who knows? The fact that they're sitting in the sun and the person's wearing shorts makes me think it's probably not that the chimpanzee's cold. So I didn't put this gesture for cold there. But it's, when it seems kind of close, we go, oh, he's saying baby. I know we do this with my grandbaby. She does the gesture for baby so I think it's kind of like this, and then she goes like this with her hand. That's not part of the gesture for baby, right? She's not doing it right, but we all know she'll see, I've got pictures of her mom and her uncle hanging around the house, and she'll point at one of the baby pictures of them and then make this baby gesture So maybe the chimpanzee is just sort of like a baby and doing kind of close and means baby, or maybe the chimpanzee means, oh, I love the doll, and the chimpanzee is doing the best it can to mimic the correct gesture, right? Maybe the chimpanzee just has an accent. But the thing is, we just have to be really careful that when we have an animal producing messages in their non-native way of communicating, we might be imposing more meaning on it than the animal intends. That's just the thing we have to be careful of. All right, we are done with that section. So I will see you guys in the next segment. We'll talk about intelligence.